You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 345, Planning a Constitutional Convention. We last left off with the Nationalists in episode 341. In that episode, the Annapolis Convention took place in September 1786. It resulted in a poor showing of delegates and a report that, well, they should try again the following year. Many Americans did not want them to try again. While the existing situation between the states might not have been optimal, many feared that handing over more power to a central government would make things even worse. For them, things were good enough the way they were. States could work out their issues through the Continental Congress. Another overarching and more powerful government risked the freedoms they had won from Britain in the Revolutionary War. There was, of course, another faction that disagreed with that school of thought. They saw the states as slowly drifting apart, politically and economically. The war that had forced the states to unite was over. People were returning to their parochial interests. To these men, this seemed like a huge mistake. The states themselves were fighting over issues of trade, borders, and other things. Foreign powers in Europe were already trying to divide the states in order to gain more influence with them. For example, shortly after the war ended, Spain closed the Mississippi River to American navigation. Spain was willing to grant better trade deals with America if the U.S. would agree to Spain's control of the Mississippi for at least 30 years. New England states were fine with that since they really wanted trade with Spain and they really didn't care about the Mississippi River. Southern and western states, though, did care much more about the river because they wanted to be able to use it to bring their goods to market, and they really didn't care about the transatlantic trade with Spain. This resulted in another of many deep political divisions that threatened to split the Union. If the Union failed, it would be far easier for foreign powers to prevail in their interests against America. Smaller states operating on their own had much less negotiating power than a united nation would. Divide and conquer was the way tyrants always operated. America needed a government that would keep them united. The initial reasons for meeting in a national convention were to resolve issues of trade and commerce. The nationalists wanted free trade between the states and to use their collective power to negotiate better trade agreements abroad. The other issue that stuck out for many was the repayment of debts from the war. For some, this was a fundamental issue of fairness. The country should repay those who helped make independence a reality, but it was also a matter of personal interest. Failure to repay foreign powers would result in an even more restricted ability to trade abroad. It could even result in another war. Some states had made great efforts to pay off their war debts, while others were barely doing anything. This also created resentment among states over nationalizing the remainder of the war debt, since those who had theirs almost already paid off really didn't want to take on the debts of the other states who had been slacking off on repaying their debts. Over the course of late 1786 and early 1787, events swung many more people in America in favor of a stronger government. The riots in New England, the worst being Shays' Rebellion, which we discussed last week, convinced many that the current Confederation of States was not strong enough to maintain law and order. The example of democracy run amok in Rhode Island, which we discussed a few weeks ago, also convinced many wealthier and more powerful men that greater protection of private property and a government that would protect such rights was a necessity. The report from the Annapolis Convention recommended that the states try again by meeting in Philadelphia in May 1787. Each state legislature would need to appoint a delegation to attend the convention. New Jersey was the first to appoint a delegation in November 1786. It included William Patterson, former Attorney General of the state, Chief Justice David Brearley, and former Governor William Livingston. In December, Virginia appointed a 9-member delegation to the convention. Most prominent on that list was George Washington. They also appointed James Madison, the legislator who seemed to most strongly back a stronger national government. Edmund Randolph, who had been Attorney General when he attended the Annapolis Convention, had since won election as governor and would go to Philadelphia as governor of the state. George Mason, famous for having authored the Virginia Bill of Rights and who had also attended the Mount Vernon Conference, also received an appointment, despite the fact that he had retired from the legislature. The state also appointed 2 former governors, Patrick Henry and Thomas Nelson. Henry declined to go, saying later that he supported states' rights and opposed the goals of the convention. Nelson also begged out, citing health issues. The state ended up appointing Richard Henry Lee, who also declined. He cited a recent appointment to the Confederation Congress and the difficulty of traveling between New York and Philadelphia to try to be part of both. Pennsylvania also appointed a 7-member delegation around the same time as Virginia. Its delegation included the president of the state, Benjamin Franklin, as well as top financial leaders Robert Morris and Gouverneur Morris. Some states, even larger ones, appointed smaller delegations. New York appointed only 3 members. One of those was Alexander Hamilton. Governor George Clinton, who was skeptical of a stronger federal government, also appointed 2 close political supporters who wanted power to remain with the states, mostly just to keep Hamilton in check. Massachusetts appointed only 4 delegates, while tiny Delaware appointed 5, including John Dickinson. Maryland didn't get around to appointing delegates until near the end of April 1787. After they made their appointments, all 5 of the appointees declined to serve. As a result, the state had to appoint a second round of delegates, which it only did on May 26th, the day after the convention actually sat and began to work in Philadelphia. New Hampshire had appointed a delegation in January, but it did not authorize any travel expenses. When none of their delegates traveled, the state appointed another 4-person delegation in June. This was more than a month after the convention began, but again, New Hampshire refused to pay any expenses. One of the delegates, John Langdon, finally agreed to pick up expenses for the delegation, which allowed him and Nicholas Gilman to go to Philadelphia. They arrived in late July, meaning New Hampshire did not participate in most of the debates. Rhode Island never appointed a delegation at all. The pro-paper money faction was still in charge there, and they just didn't trust the convention. They believed that moneyed interest from other states would try to rein in their economic policies, which they believed were benefiting their small farmers and debtors in their state. Many states that did send delegates also provided instructions on just how far the delegates could go. Delaware, for example, instructed its delegates that they could not agree to any changes that would eliminate the one-state, one-vote system that existed under the Articles of Confederation. Massachusetts required that no change be made to the annual election of members of Congress and the right of states to recall them at any time. It also instructed its delegates to maintain strict term limits on members of Congress. There were also some notable absences of Founding Fathers from the list. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were away in Europe on diplomatic posts. Samuel Adams was in a political fight with Governor John Hancock at the time and did not receive an appointment. Adams was also highly skeptical of a stronger federal government, but Hancock did appoint others who shared Adams' skepticism. He just wasn't prepared to send Adams. The Confederation Congress gave its own approval to holding the convention in February of 1787, after letting the matter sit in committee for about 4 months. According to the Confederation Congress, the convention would be, quote, for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation and reporting these proposed revisions to Congress and to the several legislatures. As I said, many of the people who were appointed delegates to the convention ended up not going at all. One of those who was particularly hesitant to attend the convention was George Washington. His initial concern was that it would violate his public pledge that he had made back in 1783 when he resigned from the Continental Army, never to meddle in public matters again. As I've said before, he considered himself retired. He was more than happy to spend the rest of his life living on his comfortable plantation. He especially didn't want to lend his name to an effort that would be seen as controversial. He worried that the convention might be seen as extra-legal by some people, an effort to overthrow the existing Republican government. He did think that changes needed to be made, but if he lent his name to this effort and it went off the rails and failed, that could really ruin his reputation. Another reason for skipping the convention was the Society of the Cincinnati. Washington had agreed years earlier to be the national leader of this group of veteran officers. The society, though, over the years had become controversial. At its first meeting in 1784, Washington had called on its members to make significant reforms in some of its more controversial practices. The members largely ignored Washington. The group was set to have its second triennial meeting in Philadelphia at the same time as the convention. Now, Washington didn't want to attend the meeting of the Cincinnati because of the society's controversy. At the same time, he didn't want to look like he was protesting this group of some of his closest friends by his refusal to attend. He wrote to the society's other leaders that he no longer wished to serve as president of the society when his term ended in 1787, and that he would not attend the national meeting in Philadelphia because he was retired from public life. He didn't cite any of the controversies. He simply cited his poor health and a busy schedule as reasons for not attending. If Washington then attended the Constitutional Convention, which met at the same time in the same place, his excuses for skipping the meeting of the Cincinnati would look, well, insincere, to put it politely. For these reasons, Washington sent his regrets to Governor Randolph and said that he would not attend the Federal Convention in Philadelphia. Randolph and Madison, however, refused to take no for an answer. The Nationalists were relying on Washington's reputation as a way of encouraging other states to attend this convention. Remember, when they held the convention a year before in Annapolis, most of the states didn't even show up. Washington was the most well-respected figure on the continent. His mere attendance at the convention lent immediate credibility to it. Randolph responded to Washington's letter declining the appointment by saying he would hold open Washington's spot for the time being, hoping that circumstances might change his mind, noting that he could always replace Washington on the delegation later if needed. Randolph, Madison, and others in the Virginia delegation then began a pressure campaign to convince Washington that he really should attend. As time passed, word spread across the continent that Washington would attend the convention as part of the Virginia delegation. This put Washington on the spot. If he went, he looked like he supported the convention. But if he did not go at this point, he looked like he opposed it. There was no good way for him to remain neutral. Madison and the other delegates also put personal pressure on Washington to attend, impressing on him that the United States would fall apart if this convention was not a success, and that everything they had worked for their entire adult lives and fought for during the war was going to die along with it. Beyond the Virginia delegation, others also began to pressure Washington to go. Henry Knox, who was putting down Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, took the time to write to Washington about the chaos and about the need to have a stronger government. Knox had been Washington's chief of artillery during the war and had a close relationship with the commander. Knox, of course, had also been a founding member of the Society of the Cincinnati, and he was saying nothing about that. Similarly, David Humphreys of Connecticut wrote to Washington about the need for him to attend. Humphreys had been Washington's closest aide in the final years of the war. Humphreys had been by Washington's side when he resigned his command in Annapolis and had traveled home to Mount Vernon with him at the end of the war. Soon, an all-out letter-writing campaign flooded Mount Vernon. Benjamin Franklin and Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania, William Livingston of New Jersey, and John Jay of New York were among those who wrote Washington to convince him that his attendance was vital to the convention's success. Finally, by the end of March, just over a month before the convention was scheduled to begin, Washington wrote to Randolph, reluctantly agreeing to go. The report from the Annapolis Convention had recommended the time and place for the convention to meet. It had suggested May 14, 1787, in Philadelphia. You may recall that the Continental Congress had left Philadelphia, you might even say they fled the city, in 1783 at the end of the war. A bunch of soldiers had surrounded the State House, later called Independence Hall, and were demanding their promised benefits. Back at that time, when state officials refused to offer protection for Congress, they ended up leaving the city, first meeting in New Jersey and Maryland before finally settling in New York City in 1785. Despite the decision of Congress to leave Philadelphia, it was still considered a good meeting place for national events. It was the largest city on the continent and was relatively central location for people that had to travel there. There were actually two other major conventions going on at the same time. As I already mentioned, the Society of the Cincinnati was meeting in Philadelphia, as was a National Convention of Presbyterian Ministers. James Madison was the first to arrive in Philadelphia. He came on May 3rd, nearly 2 weeks before the convention was scheduled to begin. He'd come straight from New York, where he was serving in the Continental Congress. In Philadelphia, he got a room at the boarding house across the street from the State House. Madison had been preparing for this convention for months. He had written a paper called Vices of the Political System of the United States, which laid out the problems for the current system. Among the problems that Madison identified were the failure of states to provide proper financing to the government. Many states simply ignored congressional requisitions for money. States also interfered with Congress's authority, such as making their own state treaties with each other and with Indian tribes, often ignoring Congress's treaties with those same bodies, as well as treaties that Congress had made with foreign countries. States regularly acted in their own self-interest and against the national interest. Issues regarding trade, naturalization of citizens, building infrastructure such as canals were all being blocked by various parochial interests, and this was damaging the nation as a whole. Madison noted the inability of states to protect the basic rights of Republican government. Powerful minorities might rise up and just void the acts of elected governments. This was certainly a reference to incidents such as Shays' Rebellion. Governments did not always have the power to enforce their own laws. He also noted that slavery made a sham of Republican government generally. States had the power to ignore laws passed by Congress and have their local courts enforce their actions. States were also passing all sorts of crazy laws, and often regularly changing their laws so frequently that it was hard for people to keep up with them. Many of the laws were just stupid, or as Madison more politely put it, quote, prove a want of wisdom. Many state leaders acted only out of personal ambition or interest rather than the public good. Even when laws were the will of the people, Madison often noted that people were willing to violate the basic rights of others out of a personal interest. There needed to be more checks and balances. Madison thought this country needed a new government if it was going to address these mortal wounds to their future. Madison also brought with him a draft constitution, which would come to be known as the Virginia Plan. It called for a bicameral legislature. One house would be elected by the people of each state based on the population of free inhabitants. The second house would be elected by the first house, chosen from nominations sent by the state legislatures. It also called for a national executive to be chosen by the legislature to ensure execution of the laws. The executive, along with members of a judiciary, would have the power to review all laws and veto the ones that they did not like. His proposed national government would have the power to admit new states to the Union and ensure that all states, new and old, maintain a Republican form of government. States would be obligated to support the Union and all its laws, but there would be a way for states to amend the Constitution. Madison's plan was clearly a draft with many details to be determined by the convention, but Madison was clearly looking for a radical change from the Confederation. This would be a national government with 3 branches and with a connection directly to the people through voting, not just appointees by state officials. Madison would have more than a week before the other delegates arrived. He did call on Benjamin Franklin, who lived only a block away and who was happy to discuss plans with the young delegate from Virginia. The next delegate to arrive in Philadelphia came on May 13th, when George Washington rode into town. Of course, the entry of the admired former general got far more attention than Madison's arrival. As when he traveled anywhere, Washington ended up having to make regular stops to attend parties and parades in his honor. The Philadelphia Light Horse met Washington and escorted him into the town. Washington had made reservations at the same boarding house where Madison was staying, but Pennsylvania delegate Robert Morris insisted that Washington stay in his nearby mansion as his personal guest. The next day, 3 more Virginia delegates arrived in town. The Virginia and Pennsylvania delegations walked to the State House the following morning, but that was about it. No one else arrived at the appointed time. The delegates who were present opened the convention, meeting in the East Room of the State House, the same room where the Continental Congress had met, and then they immediately adjourned due to a lack of a quorum. So rather than getting down to business, the delegates would have to wait for more state delegations to arrive. It took nearly 2 weeks for the delegations from at least 7 states to make it to Philadelphia, enough to have a quorum. Over that 2 weeks, the delegates dribbled in slowly. Poor weather was partly to blame, but also no one just seemed to think it was a big deal if they showed up late. Finally, on Friday, May 25th, the convention had a quorum to do business. Next week, we will discuss how the convention begins and what they did when they finally got down to business. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, John Celentano, Michael Mulhern, and Mitchell Anderson. Thanks also to Robert Morris Circle supporters Chasen Harrison and Anthony McGinnis. I also want to welcome Gordon Kemp, who joined the Robert Morris Circle last month. I really do appreciate everyone who helps to support this podcast. Now, for those of you who listen to these episodes when they're first released, we have our next Zoom roundtable meeting coming up this week. We're going to be meeting with Kostya Kennedy, author of The Ride, Paul Revere and the Night That Saved America. I'll discuss his book with him, then open up the discussion so that you can ask the author questions as well. I try to hold events like this each month. If you want to join us, be sure to sign up for my mailing list or join the podcast on Patreon. That's where I send notices for these events. If you are not listening live, don't worry. I hope to publish a recording of the event in a few weeks. In the main episode this week, we covered the events leading up to the Constitutional Convention. What struck me most was how little delegates really seemed to care about this event. Most of them showed up weeks late and without any real preparation. The only one who really did seem prepared was James Madison. He was the one who seemed to take the convention seriously as an effort to reinvent government. In hindsight, he certainly had it right. But at the time, I could see why there wasn't much greater interest in the convention, which was known as the Federal Convention. The convention was advertised as an effort to get together and come up with some advice for the Confederation Congress on how to amend the Congress. This led many to see this as some sort of working group that was just going to make some suggestions on changes. Any real change would still have to go before the Confederation Congress. Of course, we now know that didn't happen. The convention sent its work directly to the states with a proposal to completely create a new federal government that would replace the Articles of Confederation and would essentially put the Confederation Congress out of business. A big reason why the convention did become so important was thanks to the presence of George Washington. As we discussed in the main episode, he was still seen as a national leader who made independence possible. Washington had largely stayed out of the way in the 4 years since the war ended. His return to national events made everyone take notice. His support for the convention's work is what gave it the credibility when there really was no legal basis for simply removing the Articles of Confederation and ending them. Now, as we'll see over the next few episodes, the efforts to reach a consensus at that convention were going to be difficult enough, and getting the states to ratify that work was even harder. But at the time, there was a growing group of nationalists who realized that the United States needed a more powerful federal government. Otherwise, this federation would simply fall apart as various states found greater competition with their neighbors and probably would eventually turn to the major powers of Europe for more support. It's also important to remember that the conventional wisdom in Europe at this time was that the American experiment would inevitably fail at some point. Maintaining a government without a king simply didn't work in the long term. At some point, states would turn to European allies and return to the natural state of things, which meant the American states would be colonies. In Europe, John Adams regularly encountered this attitude. In response, he wrote a book called A Defense of the Constitutions of Government of the United States of America. The main goal of this book was to convince European elites that a proper constitution could not only replace a monarch, but was actually a much better solution. The very direct reason for him writing the book was a response to the publication of an essay by a French baron named Henri Robert Turgot, who had been critical of the American government. Turgot had first began this debate in 1778. It wasn't published until 1784, after his death. By 1786, though, it had gained considerable traction as part of the broader European criticism of American republicanism. Now, Adams initially planned to write his refutation just to share with some of his friends in Europe. However, it became a larger and all-consuming project for him over the several months that he worked on it. As he wrote, he was getting letters about the disturbances that became Shays' Rebellion and other problems in America leading up to the convention in Philadelphia. Adams wrote this book in 1786, publishing it in January 1787. As I said, his target audience for this book was mostly European aristocrats and thought leaders. Adams, however, was also well aware of the building interest in America for a new constitution. Adams had been in Britain for many years as the American ambassador and remained there, but he still kept close tabs on events in America. So his publication, A Defense of Constitutions, reached America in April 1787, about a month before the convention began. So while Adams was not at the convention to advocate for his ideas, his book did have some influence on those who were there. Adams would go on to supplement this book by writing a Volume 2 later that year and a Volume 3 the following year. I did not make Adams's book a recommendation this week, but there is a link on my blog for this episode to get a copy of Volume 1 of his book. It's available on archive.org. If you've never visited my blog, I include far more resources than the 2 recommendations I mentioned on the podcast. There's usually more than a dozen. You can check it out at blog.amrevpodcast.com. Well, speaking of my recommendations, my book recommendation this week is The Summer of 1787 by David O. Stewart. There's a number of good books covering the Constitutional Convention, but this is one of my favorites. It tells the story of the people and events in a compelling way. The author, Stewart, has written a number of good books on this era. You may recall that I interviewed him for another book he wrote about George Washington. Stewart's book on the Constitution does a great job of covering the issues and debates in what I think is a very readable way. So if you want to read more about what we discussed this week and we'll probably be discussing over the next few weeks, get a copy of The Summer of 1787. My online recommendation is a website at the University of Wisconsin-Madison that has copies of all the state instructions given to delegates attending the Constitutional Convention. This is a great collection of primary sources that gives you a feel for what state leaders thought that the convention could or should address. And as always, I've included direct links on my blog and website. My question this week asks, did Thomas Jefferson and the legislative body of Virginia get any flack because of their inability, unwillingness maybe, to aid the war effort, particularly after the invasion of Virginia? Jefferson obviously rose to the highest possible point, but did not those years bite him in the back at all, or were they simply forgotten? Well, in part at least, Governor Jefferson was acting on the will of the people of Virginia. Although Virginia sent a fair number of soldiers to participate in the Continental Army, especially early in the war, it was pretty stingy in raising money to support the war effort, especially when the war was being fought in other states. When the war finally did come to Virginia in a big way in 1781, Virginians still seemed pretty unwilling to turn out to fight or even to come up with money to support the war. Arguably, part of this fault must remain with Governor Jefferson, who seemed incapable of rallying the state, but the state culture itself contributed to this and probably could not be easily changed. Now, there was grumbling in other states when Virginia demanded more help after the British invaded their state. Many others thought Virginia had done so little for them that they really didn't feel obliged to help Virginia. In the end, though, they did. General Washington made Virginia a priority, but even for Washington, it was because his French allies demanded it. In 1781, Washington was still more interested in taking New York City than he was taking the army to his home of Virginia. Now, there was some flack because of the failure of Virginia to put up much of a defense. Jefferson, of course, lost his re-election as governor, and he was completely out of any office for the next 2 years, before briefly returning to the Continental Congress and then being sent off for diplomatic work in France. During the election of 1800, Jefferson did in fact take some criticism for his poor performance as governor during the war, but by that time his reputation as the author of the Declaration of Independence and his work as minister to France and as Secretary of State outshined that criticism. Besides, many Americans were unhappy with the incumbent in the election of 1800, in large part due to the passage of the very unpopular Alien and Sedition Acts, as well as the quasi-war with France. That election was more about change than about litigating 20-year-old performance criticisms. As a result, Jefferson won the election and became our nation's third president. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on X, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.